The snow had not stopped for 3 days. It came down in a quiet fury, not with the gentle drift of winter in storybooks, but with a heavy persistence that muffled every sound, blanketed every trail, and pressed the world into a hush so thick even breath seemed swallowed whole. The prairie, once endless and golden beneath the sun, was now a white void stretching into horizon, without road or marker. The only proof that life existed at all were 5 women huddled in the lee of a broken wagon, their shawls and skirts stiff with frost, their lashes crusted with white crystals that stung when they blinked. They had been abandoned at dawn 3 days earlier. Men they had trusted, husbands to some, brothers to others, mere traveling companions to the rest, had woken before the first light and gone about quietly. There had been no explanation, no farewell, only the scuff of boots in snow, the distant clink of harness buckles, and the sound of horses urged forward. By the time the women stirred from sleep, the men were already silhouettes fading into the storm, their wagon and provisions rolling steadily away. All that remained were scraps, a torn blanket, a half-empty sack of flour, and the cold echo of betrayal. One woman had screamed after them, stumbling into the snow with her arms bare and wild. The sound had been torn away by the wind, carried off like a feather. Another had stood silently, lips parted, too stunned for words. A third had fallen to her knees, sobbing not from the cold but from the hollowness settling inside her chest. By the time their voices returned, the men were gone, their tracks already vanishing beneath the storm. Now, 3 nights later, hunger gnawed like a beast inside them. Lips cracked until they bled when they whispered. Hands shook even beneath shawls. Still, pride lived in the hollows of their eyes. They were survivors, each in her own way, though none had ever thought it would come to this, to crouching beneath brokenwood while the wind screamed above, waiting for the mercy of death or miracle. And yet, they stayed alive, not by choice but by some stubborn root of will that would not yet break. The eldest among them had been a wife to a cattleman once. She bore the dignity of years, though grief had carved her face deeper than time. Her shawl was frayed, her hands swollen with cold, but her gaze remained steady as she watched the horizon for signs of life. She spoke sparingly, her voice a rasp from years of dust and loss. It was she who muttered first, on that first morning without the men, "They are gone, and we are left to die." Another, younger, with hair the color of cornsilk now dull with ice, shook her head then. "No," she had whispered, defiance trembling in her voice. "We will not die here." But each hour that passed, each scrap of bread they rationed thinner, each fire that smoked and died from damp wood, made her words sound less like promise and more like prayer. The others carried their own shadows. One had been cast out from her family in Missouri, carrying shame heavier than any trunk. Another had fled a marriage she would not speak of, her silence more cutting than words. The 5th was a widow barely past 20, her ring still shining on her frozen hand, her belly hollow with the child she had lost before the journey began. There were 5 threads torn loose from the fabric of the world, knotted together not by choice but by circumstance, and now tangled in the storm that cared nothing for names or stories. That night, the wind cut sharper, snow slanted like knives, stinging cheeks until numbness spread. They pressed together beneath the wagon's shadow, their bodies a fragile fortress of warmth. One began to whisper a prayer, the words trembling on her lips. "Please don't kill us." At first, it seemed she spoke to the storm itself, as if the swirling whiteness were a beast that might show mercy if begged. But the others knew what she meant. Death lurked near. Hunger could finish them. So could wolves. So could men, if any stumbled upon them in this desolation. They prayed not for comfort, but for simple permission to live. The night stretched endlessly. Dreams came sharp and bitter. Visions of hearth fires, of bread steaming from the oven, of children laughing. Each dream shattered upon waking to cold breath and emptiness. The sack of flour lay flat now, its last crumbs dusted into a thin paste mixed with snow, eaten in silence. Their stomachs clenched and groaned but found no relief. By morning, the sky cleared faintly. A pale light spilled over the horizon, turning the snow into endless mirrors that blinded the eyes. They stirred weakly, brushing frost from lashes, stiff from stillness. One woman rose to her knees, squinting across the expanse. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Do you see it? There." The others followed her gaze. At first, it seemed only a smudge, a trick of the eyes born from exhaustion. But no, it grew darker, clearer. A figure moved against the endless white. A horse carried it, slow and sure, head bent against the wind. Rider and beast both were wrapped in rough hides, their colors blending with earth rather than snow. The figure drew closer, and unease crept through the women's veins, warming them faster than fire. They knew, even from afar, by the way he sat his horse, by the cut of his clothing, that he was no settler, no townsman, no fellow traveler lost in the storm. "He's Apache," one whispered, her voice brittle with fear. Another drew back, clutching her shawl to her throat. In every town they had passed, the warnings had come sharp as bullets. Savage, murderer, enemy. Mothers hushed children with tales of raids. Men boasted of battles fought in canyons. To see one so close, alone on the plains, was to see a ghost step out of story into flesh. The horse slowed as it neared. Snow crunched beneath its hooves, each sound sharp in the frozen silence. The warrior dismounted without haste, his movements calm, deliberate. He stood tall, shoulders broad beneath a hide cloak, his hair black, his raven wings falling loose about his face. His eyes, dark and steady, swept over the huddled women without flicker of expression. He carried no rifle, only a bow slung across his back and a knife at his belt. Yet his presence alone filled the air heavier than the storm. The women froze, breaths shallow, hearts pounding. One whispered the words again, soft as a confession. "Please don't kill us." This time, it was not to the storm, not to death, but to the man standing before them, silent as stone. The phrase hung between them, fragile as glass, waiting for his hand to break it or cradle it. He did not answer. His gaze lingered a moment longer, unreadable, then shifted. Without a word, he turned from them, bent, and gathered a handful of snow-damp twigs from beneath the wagon. His knife scraped flint, and sparks leapt to life. Within moments, a fire hissed, small but real, its smoke curling thin and blue against the pale sky. The women stared, too stunned to speak. Their bodies trembled, not from cold now, but from the weight of this moment. The stranger who could choose their death or life with equal silence had built them fire. The flames crackled. The women's eyes reflected it, wide and uncertain. None dared to move closer yet. The Apache warrior sat on the other side of the fire, his back to the wind, his profile carved in shadow. He said nothing. He did not look at them again. The fire spoke in his stead. It whispered of warmth, of survival, of the chance, fragile and flickering, that they might see another dawn. The snow kept falling, but it seemed softer now, each flake landing gentle against the fire's glow. Silence hung thick, yet it was no longer the silence of death. It was a silence heavy with questions, with fear, with the beginning of something none of them yet understood. And so the women sat, their bodies still curled in mistrust, but their eyes drawn again and again to the stranger who had come out of the storm. They did not know if he was savior or executioner. They only knew that in the heart of the desolation, a fire now burned, and for the first time since betrayal, they felt the ache of life return. The eldest lifted her gaze to him across the flames, lips trembling. She wanted to speak, but found no words. And so the fire cracked, the snow fell, and the Apache warrior remained silent, his dark eyes reflecting both the storm and the souls he had found stranded within it. The storm swallowed the horizon once more, and the night crept in thick and long. But beneath the wagon, by that fire, 6 figures now sat instead of 5. And in that fragile company, the story turned towards something neither the women nor the warrior could yet name, but all felt beating quietly beneath the silence. The fire smoldered through the night, a fragile circle of warmth pressed against the endless cold. The women sat stiffly, their shawls pulled tight, their eyes fixed on the stranger who had conjured flame out of damp twigs and silence. He had not spoken once, not when he dismounted, not when their whispers of fear brushed the air like moth wings, not even when the eldest woman, her voice cracked from thirst, rasped, "Why?" The only answer was a hiss of sparks rising into snow and vanishing. He had placed no barrier between himself and them, nor did he invite them closer. He simply tended the fire, fed it sparingly, and then sat across from them with the stillness of stone. The horse, tethered loosely, pawed the snow now and again, its breath curling into the dark. The storm eased by midnight, and stars broke through cold, hard points of light that watched the little company huddle beneath the wagon's ruined frame. The women did not sleep deeply. Each drifted in and out, minds fevered by hunger and mistrust. Some dreamed of hands pulling them away in the dark. Others dreamed of hearts long gone cold. Every time their eyes opened, they found him there still, unmoving but alert, his dark gaze reflecting the dying embers. He seemed less a man than part of the land itself, some figure carved out of earth and fire who had risen to watch them through the night. When dawn bled pale across the horizon, they stirred. One tried to rise and fetch snow to melt, but her legs buckled, and she sank down again with a soft cry. He rose then without word, scooped snow into a tin pot, and set it near the fire. The women watched silent, as the water hissed and steamed, as he poured it carefully into a wooden cup and held it out. For a long moment, none dared move. Finally, the youngest reached, her hands trembling, their fingers brushed for an instant, rough skin against frozen flesh, and she snatched back as if burned. He said nothing, only shifted the cup into her grip, then moved on, gathering more snow. One by one he gave them water. He did not drink until all had sipped. This small ordering, his hunger set last, their needs set first, spoke louder than any words might have. Still, the women's eyes flickered uneasily, as if such grace might yet conceal some cruel trick. By mid-morning, he was gone into the storm. He took his bow, his knife, and vanished without so much as a glance at them. Fear twisted through their bellies. Abandonment again? Had he come only to witness their misery, to stretch out the hours of their dying? They huddled close, trying to catch sight of him in the whirling white. But the land had swallowed him whole. Time dragged. The wind gnawed. By the time he returned, the light had already begun to wane. Across his shoulders lay the small body of a hare, limp and bloodied, its fur stiff with frost. Without flourish, he laid it by the fire, skinned it with swift, clean movements, and set the meat to cook. The smell rose sharp and rich, and ached to their starved bellies. The women's eyes followed every motion, torn between hunger and fear. When at last he divided the flesh into equal pieces and placed them near, they hesitated. Then, slowly, shame battled with need, they ate. He did not touch his share until all others had finished. Only then did he chew, slow and deliberate, his gaze turned not to them but to the fire. It was the eldest who spoke first, her voice low, warm with authority that even hunger could not strip. "Why do you help us?" She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if trying to read a language etched into his silence. "What is it you want?" His gaze shifted to her, not cold, not soft, simply steady. He said nothing. A long moment stretched. The fire cracked between them. Finally, he looked away, reached into his pouch, and pulled out dried berries, placing them carefully by the fire for later. His silence was answer enough. He wanted nothing, or at least nothing they could yet name. That night, as they lay close together, one woman whispered, "Perhaps he means to keep us alive, only to hand us over to his people." Another shushed her, glancing nervously at his shadow, though he gave no sign of listening. Their whispers grew sharper as the hours passed, fear biting at them in the absence of bread. Some distrusted his every gesture. Others clung to the fragile thread of hope his fire represented. By the third day, a rhythm took hold. He rose before them, disappeared into the white, and returned with what game or roots he could find. He tended the fire, rationed water, and only after ensured his own needs. The women, for their part, began to stir from passivity. The eldest gathered twigs for him, her stiff hands fumbling but determined. The widow took to brushing snow from his horse's coat, murmuring softly though the animal did not know her tongue. The youngest repaired tears in garments with needle and thread, her hands raw but persistent. None of these acts were requested. They were given hesitantly, as offerings of gratitude or apology, or perhaps simply as a way to claw back dignity. He accepted them without word, without smile or nod, yet he did not turn them away. That, too, was a kind of grace. Still, Fear did not vanish. At night, their minds conjured terrors, stories of scalps, of raids, of captives taken. They eyed the knife at his belt and wondered how quickly it might turn against them. And yet, when the snow howled and the fire dwindled, their eyes always sought him. They looked for the outline of his shoulders, for the quiet steadiness with which he faced the storm. Fear might twist their bellies, but his presence kept them breathing. It was on the fourth night that a shift came. The storm had grown so fierce that even the fire sputtered and died. Its smoke whipped away before sparks could catch. They shivered in darkness, pressed so close they could feel one another's ribs. For the first time, the stranger did not sit apart. He moved closer, crouched near, his hide cloak spread to block the wind's sharp edge. His shoulder brushed against theirs. The warmth of his body bled into their circle. No one spoke. No one moved away. Fear still prickled, but it bent beneath the heavier weight of need. When morning came, clearer skies stretched above them, blue and hard as steel. The storm had broken. The prairie lay endless and white, the wagon half buried. The world seemed both beautiful and cruel in its vast silence. The women stirred, weak but alive. The warrior stood tall, eyes scanning the horizon. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, rough, shaped by a tongue foreign to their ears, but his words, in broken English, were clear enough. "We move soon." The sound startled them. His silence had been so complete, it seemed almost unnatural to hear him speak. Yet the authority in his tone, quiet though it was, carried no room for argument. They nodded, even as dread coiled within. Move where? Toward town, toward judgment, toward men who had abandoned them, or into deeper wilderness, where survival might demand more than they were willing to give. The eldest looked at him long, her eyes sharp as flint. "We will follow." Her voice cracked, but it held. The others glanced among themselves, hesitant, uncertain, but one by one they nodded. Fear bound them, hunger drove them, and the strange, steady presence of the Apache had become something like a lifeline. Better to move with him than to wait for death to circle closer. He turned without further word, gathering his horse, preparing for the journey. The women gathered what rags and scraps remained, binding shawls tighter, clutching fragments of hope. They felt the sting of the unknown pressing down, but also the faintest stirrings of strength. Strength born not of rescue, but survival shared, of a silence that spoke louder than pity. As they set out, the wind caught their footprints and began to erase them. The prairie swallowed the marks of their passing, just as it had swallowed the men who had left them. But these five did not vanish. They moved forward, following a figure carved out of storm and silence, uncertain if he was deliverance or doom. And though their hearts trembled, though whispers of fear still tangled their thoughts, a new thread had been woven between them and the warrior. A thread spun not from words, but from fire, from food, from the simple, relentless act of staying when all others had fled. It was enough to keep them walking into the blinding white, enough to make them believe, if only for a moment, that they were not utterly forsaken. The sky stretched endless above, the snow endless below. Their breaths rose in unison. 5 women and 1 warrior, moving together through desolation. None knew what awaited. All knew only this. The silence had changed. It no longer promised death alone. It carried, faint and fragile, the sound of survival. The storm had lessened, but its memory still pressed heavy upon the land. Snow lay deep across the clearing, sparkling under a pale sun that struggled to warm the frozen wilderness. The log walls of the shelter creaked as the wind teased through chinks, and smoke from the fire rose in a thin gray ribbon to the hole in the roof. Inside, silence held the women close, broken only by the hiss of green with catching flame. Every eye, whether openly or from the corner of a glance, turned again and again toward the tall figure crouched near the fire, silent, strong, and apart. The Apache warrior had given his name only once, his voice low, roughened by solitude. Taji. He had spoken it not as an offering, but as one might give a warning, a sound that carried weight and carried boundaries. To the 5 abandoned women, his presence remained both shield and shadow. They owed him their lives. His snares had brought them meat, his hands had coaxed fire from wet wood, His strength had pulled one of them from the snow when she had stumbled near frozen, but gratitude did not still the unease that lived in their bones. Mary, eldest among them, kept her hands busy mending a tear in her skirt with thread pulled from an old hem, though her eyes seldom left him. She was nearing 40, lines deepened at her brow from years of prairie hardship, her figure worn lean by work and loss. To her, every choice meant survival, and she watched Taji with a hard, weighing gaze, as though she could measure his trustworthiness like sacks of grain. Beside her sat Ruth, still in her 20s, fair-haired and restless. She gnawed at her lip and stole glances that betrayed a different conflict, fear warred with curiosity in her pale eyes. She had grown up on tales of savages and raids, yet here sat a man of that same blood who had not raised his hand against them, who had carried wood and meat without demand. Something in Ruth itched to understand the gap between stories and the figure before her. Abigail, dark-haired and solemn at 30, clutched her shawl tightly. Her husband had been among those who abandoned them to the storm, and grief burned quiet but fierce within her. She did not speak often, but her silence was not passive. It judged, it weighed, and when her gaze fell upon Taji, it was not fear that filled it, but something more complex. Suspicion rooted in old wounds, and yet, unwillingly, a reluctant gratitude. The two younger women, Sarah, just 17, with a softness still clinging to her, and Ellen, scarcely 21 but hardened by a short, brutal marriage, kept close together. They whispered often, their words half frozen in the air before fading. Sarah looked to Taji as if he were a figure out of some fearful legend, while Ellen's eyes narrowed each time his shadow fell near, as though she expected betrayal with every breath. Taji himself said little. His movements were deliberate, quiet. He tended the fire, cut meat with his knife of bone and steel, and when the women's eyes lingered too long, he would meet them briefly, his gaze neither soft nor cruel, but steady as the stone ridges from which he had come. He carried the solitude of mountains upon him, and though he dwelled now in their fragile company, he was never fully among them. That evening, as dusk bled purple through the snow-bound pines, hunger pressed at them again. Taji laid strips of venison upon a flat stone near the fire. The rich scent filled the small shelter, stirring stomachs that had long forgotten plenty. When the meat was ready, he placed it before them with no word, taking only a portion for himself. Mary's voice, rough with long restraint, broke the hush. "You saved us from death," she said, her eyes fixed upon him. "We know that, but tell us plain, why? What do you want with us?" The crackle of fire answered first. The other women stilled, breath held, as though the question itself might split the fragile peace. Taji lifted his gaze slowly to Mary. His dark eyes, unreadable as the snow-bound ridges, rested on her. At last he spoke, his English halting, touched by the weight of another tongue. "I do not want." A pause, and quieter still. "Snow kills quick. I let you live. That is all." His words hung in the air, simple and yet sharp enough to cut. No promise of safety beyond this night. No explanation of kindness beyond survival. Abigail let out a sharp breath, almost a scoff. Men don't do things for nothing. Taji's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Instead, he reached for his knife and began sharpening it with a slow scrape of stone. The sound echoed like steel upon bone, and the women shifted uneasily. It was Ruth who, after a silence stretched too long, spoke softly. "Maybe he's not like the men we've known." Her words faltered under Mary's stern look, but the thought had been loosed into the air and could not be drawn back. That night, when sleep took them in uneasy waves, Ruth stirred. The fire had fallen low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. She saw Taji seated near the doorway, eyes not closed but fixed outward, watching the darkness beyond. Like a sentinel, he sat unmoving, his breath slow and steady. For the first time, Ruth felt not fear but a strange kind of safety. A man who watched the night so others could sleep. It was not the way of raiders or thieves. She wrapped her shawl tighter and drifted back into dreams with the image of him still seated, silent against the storm outside. Days passed, each one a mirror of the last. Snow yielded slowly to weak sun, but travel remained impossible. The women learned to move around him, each carving her own uneasy rhythm. Trust, If it came at all, came in fragments, whispered in looks or softened tones. Sarah laughed once, a thin sound, when Taji showed her how to strike sparks from stone. The laughter startled them all, as though joy itself were a dangerous thing in so harsh a place. But not all hearts softened. Ellen muttered often in corners, her words sharp with suspicion. He keeps us alive, yes, but for how long? What does he wait for? She clutched the memory of her husband's cruelty, her faith that men always bore hidden knives. Her mistrust seeped into Sarah's ears, planting unease again where wonder had begun to bloom. The true test came one gray morning when footsteps were heard outside the shelter. Heavy, many, breaking through crusted snow. Mary stiffened, rising to her feet. Abigail reached for his stick as though it were a weapon. Ruth froze where she sat. Taji alone moved with purpose. He motioned them to silence, his hand raised. Then, without sound, he slipped through the doorway into the white light beyond. Moments dragged, each heartbeat a hammer against their ribs. Voices carried faintly, harsh and foreign to their ears. Then a cry, the crack of a rifle. The women gasped, clinging to one another. The door burst open, and Taji entered again, swift, breath clouding. Snow clung to his hair and shoulders. In his hand was a rifle not his own. He dropped it beside the fire, eyes hard. "Men," he said, short and sharp. "Scouts. They look for trail." Abigail's face paled. "The ones who left us?" Taji's silence was answer enough. The cabin seemed suddenly smaller, the air tighter. Their abandonment had not ended their danger. Those same men who had cast them aside to die in the storm still walked the wilderness, rifles in hand, and now their tracks might lead them here. Taji stood tall, shoulders squared, as if expecting their doubt, their fear. "If they find you," he said, each word deliberate, "they kill you, or worse." His gaze swept them, leaving no room for softness. "You stay. You hide. I lead them away." The words struck like stones thrown into still water, breaking every illusion of safety they had nursed. Yet in that moment, trust, fragile, uncertain, but real, began to thread itself among them. For he, who owed them nothing, who spoke little and took less, would risk himself to protect them from their own kind. Ruth rose, her voice trembling but clear. "You'll come back?" Taji looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he gave a single nod. When he slipped into the white wilderness again, his figure swallowed by snow and silence, the women remained huddled by the fire, 5 souls bound not only by survival but by the slow, reluctant weaving of trust. In that dim cabin, as wind pressed at the walls and shadows shifted across their faces, they knew the world had changed. No longer were they merely abandoned wives and daughters, waiting for death or rescue. They were witnesses to something rarer. The quiet courage of a man who carried no promise but his own steadfast will. And though fear clung still to their bones, another whisper wounded its way into their hearts. One that spoke of bonds not chosen, yet forged in the crucible of fire and snow. A connection as fragile as ice and yet as enduring as stone. The storm raged through the night, but within the crude shelter of the rocky hollow, firelight cast its trembling glow upon faces drawn thin by hunger and fear. The women huddled close, blankets pulled tight around their shoulders, eyes fixed upon the figure crouched at the fire's edge. The Apache warrior, silent, watchful, every motion deliberate, fed another stick into the flames. His face was carved with shadows, his hair hanging loose to his shoulders, dark and damp from the storm. For a long time, no one spoke, but the crackle of fire and the moan of wind through stone hollow carried their thoughts as surely as spoken words. Sarah's gaze lingered on him, curiosity entwined with unease. He had saved them from freezing in the snow, carried Mary across a river that would have swept her away, and hunted meat when their strength failed. Yet trust did not come easily. He was Apache. For years, the frontier had painted his people as raiders, killers, ghosts that haunted lonely trails. And yet here he was, alone, wounded in spirit perhaps, but bound by some unspoken tether to their survival. At last, she broke the silence. "Why do you help us?" Her voice was softer than she intended, fragile as the frost lacing the cave walls. He did not look at her. Instead, he stirred the fire with a stick, eyes fixed on sparks that rose and vanished into the dark. When he answered, his words were measured, his English broken yet strong. Snow kills without care. Woman, child, man, it does not ask name. You were dying. I could not leave you. Mary, pale but stubborn even in weakness, shifted where she Saturday, and if we had met you on open ground before the storm, her words held bite, though fear trembled beneath. Would you still have helped? The warrior's eyes flicked up, catching hers, steady as a drawn bow. I do not kill for sport, not for pride, only when blood already called for blood. He paused, the firelight striking a deep line across his cheekbone. My people are hunted, my family gone. I walk alone. You ask why I help? Perhaps because I too am abandoned. A hush fell over the circle. His words, simple and bare, carried a weight that silenced even Mary's suspicion. Sarah's chest tightened. She knew abandonment too, the sudden cruelty of the frontier, the men who had fled and left them to die in the snow. And now this warrior, enemy by blood and tail, sat here as their only ally. Clara, the youngest, whispered, "What is your name?" He considered, as though a name were more than a word but a bridge across worlds. "They call me Koa," he said at last. "It means strong, but—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Strength alone does not keep ghosts away. The fire sputtered, sending shadows racing across the cave walls. Sarah felt something shift in that moment, fragile yet undeniable. A thread of connection, woven from shared loss and survival. Yet with it came the sharp reminder of danger. Settlers were near. If they stumbled upon this place and found the women with an Apache, there would be no questions asked, only bullets fired. That fear hardened in Sarah when dawn broke. The storm had passed, leaving the land blanketed in deep silence, snow glittering like crushed glass under a pale sun. From the mouth of the hollow, she saw thin smoke rising on the far ridge. Settler scouts, searching. Her breath caught. Their time was slipping away. By midday, the women gathered what little they had. Koa moved with purpose, guiding them along narrow ridges where snow lay shallow, covering their tracks with deft precision. He knew the land like a hawk knows the wind, yet even he could not erase every sign. Sarah saw his eyes darken when he spotted horse prints pressed fresh into the snow not far below. "They hunt us," he murmured. "Not wolves. Man." Fear rippled through the group. Martha clutched her shawl tighter. Mary pressed against Clara protectively, and even Sarah's own heart hammered in her chest. There were 5 women, weak from cold and hunger, with no weapon save for Koa's bow and knife. If those riders caught them, the story would end in blood. That night, firelight burned low as Koa crouched apart, sharpening his knife with long, slow strokes. The scrape of stone against steel carried across the silence. Sarah moved closer, drawn by the weight pressing upon them all. "What will you do if they find us?" she asked. He stopped, the knife catching firelight like a sliver of moon. "I will stand between. If I fall, you run. Do not look back." Her chest clenched. "And if we refuse to leave you?" His gaze lifted, dark and steady. "Then you die too, and your deaths will be my fault." The words struck her with their bluntness, their finality. She wanted to argue, to tell him they owed him more than abandonment, but the truth gnawed at her. They were not soldiers. They were women clinging to the edge of survival. Without him, they had nothing. Yet with him, they were marked for death by the very men who claimed to protect settlers. The next day, fate arrived. Hooves thundered through snow, shouts echoing off canyon walls. The riders came swift and sure, rifles glinting beneath the pale sky. Sarah's heart seized as she saw their faces. Settlers, men from a very camp that had once promised them safety. And at their lead rode Jonas Hale, a man whose eyes carried the hard light of suspicion sharpened into hatred. "There!" he bellowed, pointing toward the hollow where the women stood with Koa at their side. Traitors, harboring a savage. The women froze, but Koa stepped forward, bow drawn, an arrow knocked in the same motion. His stance was unyielding, fire blazing in his eyes. Sarah felt the moment stretch, taut as a wire, the line between survival and massacre trembling before them. Jonas raised his rifle. Step aside, women. He dies tonight. No! Sarah's voice rang sharp, surprising even herself. She moved before Koa, her hands raised though they shook. He saved us, Jonas. When your men abandoned us in the storm, he carried us through. We live because of him. Her words only hardened Jonas's sneer. Don't speak for him. He's Apache. You know what they've done. Koa's voice cut low but firm. And what have your men done? Left your own women to freeze. Tell me, who is savage? A murmur rippled through the riders, unease shadowing their faces. But Jonas's finger curled upon the trigger, his fury drowning reason. The crack of rifle fire shattered the air. Koa moved faster than sight, shoving Sarah aside as the shot rang out. The arrow flew in the same breath, striking Jonas's rifle, sending it spinning from his grasp. Chaos erupted, men shouting, horses rearing, snow churned to blood and smoke. Koa fought with fierce grace, every motion born of desperation and will, his knife flashing as he turned aside blow after blow. The women, huddled at the rocks, watched with hearts in their throats as the lone warrior battled a storm of men. Sarah's vision narrowed to firelight flashing upon steel, to the sharp cries of wounded men, to Koa's breath ragged yet unbroken. He stood like a wall between them and the world, every heartbeat buying him another chance to live. Yet she saw the cost, the gash across his shoulder, the blood darkening his tunic, the strain tightening his face. At last, silence fell. The riders, beaten and scattered, fled into the snow, leaving only the wounded groans of those two broken to ride. Jonas lay unconscious where Koa's blow had felled him, and there in the center stood Koa, chest heaving, knife slick with blood, eyes burning with fire that slowly dimmed into exhaustion. Sarah rose on trembling legs, moving to him. Her hand touched his arm, steadying him as his strength faltered. For a long moment, their eyes met, hers filled with gratitude, his shadow with pain yet softened by something deeper. In that gaze was no longer enemy and ally, but something fragile, unspoken, binding them beyond the reach of fear. The women gathered, surrounding him in silence. Martha wept softly. Clara clung to Mary, and Sarah's own throat tightened with words she could not speak. The storm outside had ended, but within them a new fire had taken root. Koa was no longer a stranger. He was salvation forged in blood and snow. Yet Sarah knew the battle was not done. Settlers would return. Suspicion would follow them wherever they went. But tonight, in the glow of firelight, redemption had taken shape, not in words, but in sacrifice, in the choice of one man to stand for those who were not his own. As the flames burned low, Sarah whispered the only words that seemed true. "We will not abandon you." Koa's eyes flickered, weary but alive. He nodded once, the faintest trace of something like hope crossing his face. And in that fragile moment, bound by firelight and blood, the threads of trust became unbreakable.